Hey.
Good. Welcome to TFOS. And I am going to try to get this video to go live in the right place. But um, let's start off for got something in my teeth. So humans, I am human and I do eat food. And sorry, I'm going to be real here. But I've had four lives. This is my fourth live in a row. So I'm actually
I
eating
think,
food. I feel
yeah,
so
this is
embarrassed.
like
I'm just going to run with it.
actually like we can run with that. There's like a real self-regulation piece to being able to like describe your experience as you're going through it and just like own being human and that we all have these strange experiences that happen to us and being able to say, "Hey, this is what's going on for me right now," and to be able to laugh with it and roll with it. I feel like if we could teach that, I think there's a step to world peace right there. Just for people to be able to say like, "Hey, this is my experience right now," instead of trying to like hide or shame or come up with an excuse.
I,
So
I like
yeah,
that frame.
if I run for Miss America, that's going to be my answer to the world peace question.
Well, let's talk about. Oh, for people who are not familiar with you, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dr. Liz Angof. I am an educational psychologist in the Bay Area, California. And my passion is helping kids understand their neurodivergent brains. So I really came across this in figuring out that kids get assessed, but nobody talks to kids about what the assessment was about. And then I started testing adults, and they would say, "Yeah, as a kid, I just thought that I was dumb, or I thought I was crazy, or I thought all kinds of negative stuff about me." And they're only just starting to rewrite the narrative. And so I've just dedicated, the better part of my career to figuring out how do we help rewrite those narratives now when kids are 8 or 5 or 12 or however, starting right now and trying to rewrite those narratives. So that is my work in the world.
Well, I have a good question for you then. And so, what we wanted to do here today, everybody, hello, we'll chat with Dr. Liz for a few minutes. And I was thinking about like what, what could we share that would be helpful? And I do have I might take this in a different direction because I do have a serious question. And that is when one of the things that I think about is when we are looking at neurodivergent kids or when we're looking at kids, we can look at so many different metrics. We can measure so many things. Now, school tends to measure things in these things called grades, percentages, and letters. And we tend to get A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's for whatever reason in a 100% scale. And then we have a thing called a grade card that is supposedly is measuring how much you've learned. That's the idea. And so in a nutshell. And then we are measuring math, science, social studies, language arts, and whatever other subjects, but those are the core areas. But there are so many more elements to human being. And when we're talking about neurodivergent human beings, there is so much complexity. And so here's my easy, hard question. If in terms of like I've looked at hundreds of neuropsych reports over the years, and it is true. Like families are given a stack of papers in a neuropsych report. If you get one, you don't need one, but still you want to know your profile of your kid or know about your kid's profile or their needs. But these neuropsych reports are not in the layman's language. And so when you're a family and you've just paid $3,000 for a report and you don't know what the report says, it can be baffling. So if you could create the Dr. Liz, the most simple, but including some of the most important metrics, the Dr. Liz profile tool. No, we did not plan this, so I'm putting you on the spot completely. What are some of the key metrics that you would wish was in like a profile of a neurodivergent kiddo?
Yeah,
Is that a fair question? Is that a good question?
I will see if I answer the question in the way that you meant it. So I'm going to have a human moment and think like there's so much on my mind right now because I've been thinking a lot about how we traditionally do assessment
Hmm.
and what our traditional metrics are, and then what it means to do a neurodiversity affirming assessment
Mm, mm, mm.
and what those metrics are. Right. And I
Rather
think
than a
that
more deficit focused, would you say?
exactly. If we're doing a traditional neuropsych assessment, we're trying to find deficits because we want to know what we have to fix. But if we are taking a neurodiversity affirming view and really understanding. And in a neurodiversity affirming view, we're not looking for a list of deficits. We're looking for understanding how this child's brain works, and we want to know where the mismatch is between how their brain works and what the environmental expectations are. And the most important metric, if that's how we are approaching assessment, is really understanding a child's lived experience. And we get that from interviews with families, really listening to what their experience is and how they understand their child. And we get it from talking to kids and asking them not only the questions that are in the assessment, what does this word mean? Or can you solve this problem? But what was that like for you? What was your experience? What was going through your brain? Did you have any strategies? Do you do things like this in the classroom? What's that like? What's it like to do the same thing when there are 30 other kids around you? And that lived experience, and if you have an assessor who can really capture that lived experience in observations, whether they're observations from the classroom or there's usually a part of the testing that says test observations, then you're gonna have something really solid to start understanding your child and kind of how they work. So I think that as I get further along in my own journey of really figuring out how do we understand a child, not how do we assess for this checklist of things, but how do we understand a child? I think that understanding their lived experience becomes the most important piece of what an assessment entails. So did I come close to answering
That's great.
the question?
That's awesome. So I love temperature checks and teaching parents different ways of temperature checks, whether it's a 1 through 10, a hot, cold, a red light, green light, yellow light, whatever, but because they're open-ended rather than like, how was school today? Fine. What's going on? Nothing. But open-ended questions that give feedback and for parents to be able to do temperature checks of whatever sort and be able to ask that sort of thing, what's your lived experience? Obviously, if you have a 7-year-old, you would use different words. If you had a 16-year-old, you'd use different words. But knowing your kid, the curiosity around what is your lived experience, what's that like for you? I think that's probably my favorite question that just came off the tongue from you is like what's that like for you? I think it's a phenomenal question to put on the side of the fridge.
Yeah, that's my favorite question to ask during assessment. It's just a very simple, what was that like?
I think you froze for a moment, but
I glitched out. Yeah, it's my favorite question to ask. Just what was that like for you? It's very simple, and I get more information from that question than most of the traditional tests that I give.
Do you ever have kids that don't give a lot, like they're not giving you a lot in the answer? And when you have a kid who doesn't say much, do you just push on to the next question, or do you give some wait time and time for them to breathe to answer a question like that? And do you have a follow-up question that you love?
There's a couple of strategies I use. One is wait time.
Good stuff.
Yeah, the wait time is really important. Another strategy is to give multiple choice. I've done enough assessments that I can kind of say like, I'm wondering if your brain was working really hard for that one, or if you were, if it kind of came easily, that answer, like how much effort were you putting in? I'll say a lot of, I'm wondering if it was X or Y, or maybe some other answer Z that I haven't thought of yet. And that can really help. Another thing that I'll say is I noticed that, am I right or wrong? So I noticed that when I gave you those pictures to remember, you were saying them to yourself. Did I get that right? Is that a strategy you were using? Because kids might not be aware, especially our little ones. They're not necessarily aware, but we use that question to bring out awareness. And
is that a strategy you're using rather than, are you just talking to yourself? It's like, no, this is the brain working.
That's so different, the difference of, like, were you talking to yourself during that? And were you using a self-talk strategy during that? Are very different responses.
And the I wonder, right? So if you're taking notes, like I wonder and I notice, put those all on the sticky on the side of the fridge too. Yeah. What's that like for you? I wonder and I notice. Awesome. And in looking at like trying to figure out the lived experience and what you're saying and how we tend to be in more of a weakness focused paradigm generally in our culture, how do you, what kind of verbiage do you use, not with kids, but, oh, maybe with kids too, but professionally or with parents in terms of looking for strengths or passion areas or interest areas or areas that they're really excelling at, especially if they're not measured. But well, either way, how do you sort of articulate how would you articulate it if we didn't have a deficit focus system and it was Liz's way? What would it be called in terms of this? Would you use the word strength based or?
I use the word strength based. I think that's in our vernacular. But every neurotype, every profile that we look at, every diagnosis has a flip side to the coin that's not in our diagnostic manual. It's not in the DSM, but there's a flip side to every piece of this. Or a different way of looking at it and kind of seeing like, okay, in certain situations, this makes things difficult, but what are the situations where this actually becomes a strength? What beautiful and amazing things does this thing say about you? You have, so kids who have difficulty paying attention are often, daydreamers, and they make connections that we would have never even thought of because their mind is going in all these different directions. So it becomes a strength in areas of creativity. Kids who have trouble shifting or transitioning from one thing to another are often really good deep divers. And so if we see the flip side of the coin, we can start to talk about a diagnosis as a child showing both the strengths and challenges that are consistent with autism. A child who shows both the strengths and challenges that are consistent with ADHD. And this is how I diagnose now. And when I write up my diagnostic description, I'll say, Seth showed both the strengths and challenges related to ADHD, and here are the strengths that he showed. He's creative, innovative, kept me laughing during the whole assessment, really relatable, and at the same time, he had difficulty with these certain tasks that are consistent with ADHD. And so I think doing that two sides of the coin way of describing any diagnosis is validating to the things that are hard. We're not sugarcoating, like, oh, your brain just has a bunch of superpowers, because that's not the lived experience of kids. Things are challenging, and we have to help them understand why things are challenging. And we need to help them see the flip side of the coin, that their brain is not broken. It's just wired differently. And there's a mismatch, and we're going to help them figure out where they thrive and make changes to the environment so they can thrive. And we're also going to help teach them some skills that are going to help them access things better. We're going to give them tools. It just shows that there's not only two sides to the diagnosis, but also multiple ways that we're going to support this child. And it's not all about the child becoming different.
And it's not just two sides to the diagnosis, but it's two sides to the aspects of the diagnosis. Like if you were to say, like similar to what you said before, if I was going to use like impulsivity, right? So maybe I'm diagnosed with ADHD and I'm impulsive. Well, the impulsivity, that could be framed as a negative thing, but that also could be framed as a positive thing, as a positive aspect, rather than the diagnosis like it's just an aspect of it in terms of spontaneity. For example,
exactly.
right? So there could be two sides of the coin for these different things, like self-starting and like task initiation. Well, you could say that there's you could find the positive to that, and like look at all these different aspects. And
right. If you actually go to explainingbrains.com/parents, there are articles on a number of different diagnoses. And looking at both what I call the highways and the construction projects for each of these. So ADHD, autism, anxiety, dyslexia, behavioral difficulties, all of these framings that we have that traditionally are looked at as a list of deficits have incredible strengths that we want to recognize for kids. And having that vocabulary, I think, is really, really important. Having the ability to say, oh, let me describe what's going on right now. This is what I see. That verbiage, I think, is really important for parents to have so that they know what to say in the moment when their child's having a hard time, or even to recognize when their child's really thriving. And it's important for the child to know, like, okay, there's two sides to this coin. It's not my fault. I'm not broken. It's a mismatch.
I want to ask one last question, and then we can wrap up. And that is that you mentioned the word neurotype. Can you give us examples of neurotypes?
Yeah, so neurotype is a way of describing just the type of brain that you might connect with. And so instead of a diagnosis saying, like, I have a disorder, you might reframe it as saying, I have this different type of brain. I have this neurotype. So instead of saying I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a different way of framing it is to say I have an ADHD neurotype, which comes with these strengths and these challenges. If I say I have ADHD, I'm kind of attached to the DSM, or the diagnostic manual. That's just that list of all the things that are hard. But this reframing, I think, is really powerful, especially for kids, to say, I have a different type of brain.
Do you know where that term came from?
Oh, great question. I don't know where I picked it up.
I'm in love with it.
I'm in love with it too. I know if you're not already familiar with their work, NeuroWild who's on Instagram, it has a number of these comics, and I'm wondering if I heard Neurotype from them for the first time. Okay. But yeah, just like a really, really great resource. But yeah, I just think it's a really powerful term to talk about your type of brain rather than what's your diagnosis.
Yeah, there's no stigma.
And it really shifts our thinking.
Yeah, Temple Grandin talks about labeling and how, like, there's these good and bad aspects to labeling. Like, it can be useful, but they're also so misused. And but I really like that. It's just there's no stigma with neurotype.
No.
Because and that's why I started today's conversation with, like, profiles and profiling, because there's no stigma with that. Like, just what's the profile like, and how would you create that? So, because I like to think about that and trip out on that, and think about just all these different areas within asynchrony. So I think about it like an EQ on an old stereo, and, like, there's all these, like, typical ranges. But everybody's so different. There's probably no human being on the planet that would be technically neurotypical.
That's in the research. Average is a myth. It's a very harmful myth, actually. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and we all have variation. I think a really powerful piece of neurotype is that we can talk about all the neurotypes in our family. And so, because neurotypical is a neurotype. And so you can have conversations with your whole family, and maybe you have a really neurodiverse family with lots of different types of brains, including neurodivergent and neurotypical brains. And so, but we can all talk about our neurotype, and we can talk about, all those little variations, and that for all brains, there are things that come easily and things that are challenging. And some types of brain have a name, like ADHD, autism, dyslexia. And some variations may just be your unique, quirky way of showing up in the world, and that's okay too. Sometimes I'll have kids come up with their own unique name for their brain because they don't fit in a box, and I think that's important to recognize. But you have a neurotype, and we're going to figure out how to name it for you, so you can have some anchors,
some buy-in and ownership, some playfulness around it, and positive pride around it. I think if I was in the classroom still, I think that would be super fun to do, to have the kids be able to come up with their own cool names for their own neurotypes.
Yes, I love it.
Okay, that's planting a seed for me for this fall.
We should talk further about the new book that's coming out, because Our Brains, which is the new book that I am developing, that should be out in a couple of months, is talking about how all of our brains are different and normalizing all of those differences, and then having kids identify what is the name of their brain, giving them creative space to come up with their own way to describe their neurotype, and then develop those self-advocacy statements. And I'm testing it with parents right now, and what's coming up over and over again is, this would be a great curriculum. This would be great to bring into a classroom. We should, have a way to print this page and, bring it in so we can do it with many, we can show it to our teacher and kind of have these statements available. So yes, I'm very excited about this idea, and we should continue to talk.
Then that is one of my biggest frustrations with education, is how the hell can you leave education, meaning you're 18 and you quote graduate, and not have ever learned how you learn and think and feel and process? How is that possible? It's because I have my own whatever. I think there's a saying, not everything that's measured matters, not everything that matters is measured, and that it's very measurable to, again, go back to A, B, C, D, F and percentages and stuff, and to say you took a test, you got these many right, these many wrong, this is the percentage, and to measure like who you are as a learner, it's not measurable, or it's not easily measurable. So we don't do it because of that, most likely, in my cynical world. And I'm not totally cynical. Everybody who doesn't know me, obviously I wouldn't be doing my work if I was, but it does drive me nuts that kids can graduate high school and not know who they are as a learner. I think that's a real disservice to humanity.
Yeah, well, I'm appreciating my own high school education, because that was one of our final exams as senior, was to describe how we learn. And we had options and we had to write a paper about it. And this is, apropos of not much, but it just is, I'm just having a moment of appreciation for all of my high school teachers. And
did that impact
the fact that was,
your life took?
Yeah, I do this for a living now, right? I teach kids how their brains work. So there must be a connection there. I think it was exceedingly impactful to have that type of reflection be an expectation. And that's what I expect, that we should be able to have these conversations with kids. And if they don't come easily, we need to find other ways to do it. And there's lots and lots of ways to help kids understand and talk about and self-advocate for themselves. But we just need to meet them there and listen.
Yeah. Right on, Dr. Liz. Well, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being here at TFOS this year, and for everything you do to serve humanity and your work. And we're at a thing called TFOS, which is the Executive Function Online Summit. So for those of you who don't know us, we're at executivefunctionsummit.com. Even though we're here right now live, there are people who still join us all the way up until Monday evening. Join us anytime. It's free until the midnight Monday evening. And share it around with your friends and tell people about it. But Dr. Liz, thanks for being here.
Yeah, and thank you for all that you do, Seth. This is such an incredible conference, and you've put so much important information out into the world. So just real gratitude to you.
Thanks for being a part of it. And thank you all for being here. Take care, everybody.